Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, your global look at news from Taiwan. I'm Chris Gorin. South Africa has asked Taiwan to move its unofficial embassy out of the African country's administrative capital, Pretoria. It's a move largely seen as appeasing South Africa's largest trading partner, China, which claims Taiwan as its territory. South Africa has asked Taiwan to move its office from the administrative capital, Pretoria, to its largest city, Johannesburg, just about a 45-minute drive away. Pretoria has since announced willingness to negotiate with Taipei on this issue, as the original deadline for the move had come and passed. Today, to discuss the implications and the fallout, we're here with Eric Olander, co-founder of the China Global South Project. Eric, thanks for joining the show.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So let's first zoom in on the news. Now, South Africa has asked Taiwan to move its liaison office out of its administrative capital. What's going on here, and how did we get to this point?
Well, this is not unusual. This is not the first time in Africa that the Chinese government has pressured a government to move the Taiwan representative office from the political capital to the commercial capital. Back in 2017, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi also did that when he visited Nigeria, and they moved it from Abuja to Lagos. So there is precedent for doing this. It's not the first time that it's happened. And again, there's no political cost to South Africa for doing this. You know, they're under a little bit of pressure from the United States and the U.S. Congress, but at the end of the day, the South African government feels like, listen, China's our largest trade partner. China's one of our most important diplomatic partners. Why not? What's the downside for them?
So, as you mentioned before, Taiwan has actually been in this situation before with Nigeria in 2017. In that case, they actually complied with the request to move the office to another city. This time they've refused. Do you view that as a new stance from President Lai, or what's your take on this?
Hard to tell. I think there's a certain amount of confidence that the U.S. Congress and now potentially the incoming Trump administration may be behind Taiwan, because South Africa's stock in Washington is at a low point because of its participation in BRICS, its engagement with Russia, its condemnation of Israel in the Gaza war and whatnot. And so I think Taiwan may be sensing the mood in Washington and hoping that Washington's going to join in the pressure to prevent this from happening. That was not the case back in 2017. Given the fact that the United States is now going through a very dramatic political transition, I think that's kind of a fool's game as well. This is not going to be a priority for Americans, especially because the State Department itself is also going to be going through a transition of leadership in South Africa with the incoming administration. So my guess is it probably has something to do with the United States backing Taiwan and supporting Taiwan, that it felt confident to refuse the order. I'm not entirely sure on the legality of this. The Taiwan side says there's an agreement. I think the South Africans probably have quite a bit of power as a host country, given the fact that Taiwan does not have formal diplomatic relations. So the office is not subject to any of the international laws that a standard embassy would be subject to in terms of closure. So there might be opportunities for the South African government to actually close the building or block it off. If it came to that. I doubt it's going to come to that, simply because I think the South Africans don't want to provoke the Americans at a time like this, when potentially AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which is the free trade agreement, is coming up for renewal. South Africa is the biggest beneficiary of AGOA in all of Africa. Taiwan may get wrapped up in this in the Congress on the renewal. So a lot of moving parts to this issue, but Taiwan itself is probably the smallest player here. And Taiwan has the weakest hand of all the major players. So that, I think, is something for us to take into account as well.
Yeah, and we're definitely going to get back to how this plays into other major powers and their influence in Africa, but I want to stay focused a little bit on the Taiwan situation first. So, from your point of view, depending on how the situation goes, what could be the fallout for Taiwan in this case, or for relations between South Africa and Taiwan?
Ultimately, I think what's going to happen, and this is not based on anything other than just looking at the precedent, and again, as I said, the weak hand that I think Taiwan has in playing this, is that they're either going to have to close the office or move it to Johannesburg. I mean, I don't think there's a lot of option in this. When it comes to the South Africans, where they're going to take sides, China is clearly a more important partner for them than Taiwan is today. Taiwan's investment in South Africa is much smaller than that of China's. Taiwan's trade with South Africa is considerably smaller Taiwan, remember, South Africa accounts for about a third of all China-Africa trade, and it is the gateway for this $280 billion trading relationship, two-way trading relationship between China and Africa. There's just no way to overstate how important China is to South Africa economically and increasingly politically, diplomatically, in so many different ways. So when we look at where the calculations are being made inside DIRCO, the foreign ministry in Pretoria, I think they're saying to themselves, this is not an issue for us. Close the office, move the office, I don't care. But China is going to be our focus, especially if the United States imposes new tariffs on imported goods, closes down the AGOA free trade agreement, then China is going to be even more important for South Africa. And so the question of whether or not they're going to squeeze Taiwan, I don't know. I just don't see what kind of recourse Taiwan has to change that equation.
And just generally speaking, despite the fact that obviously Taiwan is a much smaller player in Africa than China, as far as you know, what are their sort of goals for their policies in Africa?
For a while it was to maintain the few diplomatic relationships that it has. Now it's down to just one, Eswatini. That's not a great diplomatic relationship for Taiwan. It's not a good look for Taiwan that it's partnered with a kingdom that is, non-democratic, authoritarian in its way and its handling of things. I mean, it's not a good look for Taiwan that this is its main partner in Africa today. Taiwan has also made some inroads in Somaliland as well. But for the most part, Taiwan is not a major player in Africa. It's not a priority for the Taiwan Foreign Ministry. There is some investment that's there. A lot of it is in South Africa. The historical legacy, of course, is in South Africa because during the apartheid years, Taiwan had diplomatic relations prior to Mandela coming to power. The ANC has not forgotten that Taiwan was partners with the apartheid government. Okay, so there's no love lost between the ruling ANC and Taiwan on this issue. Taiwan has a pretty small, light footprint in Africa, and what it does is again bordering on insignificant compared to the other major powers and not even major powers, even middle powers like Turkey and the Emirates and others that are very active in Africa today. It's not Taiwan.
Okay, well, let's now zoom out a little bit. And one thing I really want to discuss with you is when we talk about Africa in the sense of geopolitics, what are we actually talking about here? I mean, this is a continent with more than 50 countries in it. Does it really make sense to talk about Africa as one block of countries with common interests? What are we really talking about when we say Africa?
I mean, we could ask the same question of Europe, and there's the European Union. We could ask the same kind of question of any number of regional, groupings. And so Africa certainly is an incredibly diverse continent, 54 countries, 1.4 billion people, countless languages, religious, racial, cultural differences, so much diversity and variety. So yes, by talking about Africa, you certainly have the risk of flattening an incredibly dynamic continent. But at the same time, there are some interests which is represented by the African Union and by regional groups like ECOWAS, SADC, the SADC, the East African Community. These regional groups do account, like the African Union, for broader interests. So, for example, food security is a broader interest. Climate change is a broader interest. Agricultural exports, employment. These are all interests that transcend all of the countries in Africa today, even South Africa, which is among the most economically advanced of the continent. Youth unemployment is staggeringly high. And so in that sense, working across the continent on regional and even continental issues makes a lot of sense. At the end of the day, though, when African countries interact with countries like China, for example, they do so predominantly as a bilateral level. So there are bilateral relationships, there are regional relationships, and then there are continental relationships. And a sophisticated view of the continent has to appreciate the subtleties of all three.
So, insofar as we can think of Africa as one block of countries with common interests, what do you see as China's main interests in Africa now?
Economically speaking, a lot of people think that China's there for the oil, mineral, and timber. And for the most part, in the 2000s, when they were looking for new markets to go out, there was Africa. The US and Europe had largely disengaged after the Cold War. They kind of looked down on the continent as a place for aid, war, famine, and there was really not a lot of enthusiasm in the West to engage with Africa other than on aid and on charity and on military issues. The Chinese came and they said, listen, we don't do aid and charity, we do business. And Africans said, that's great because we're tired of aid and charity with these other guys. And so one of the things that the Chinese did was they broke this centuries old dependence on Europe and later on the US. And that provided African countries for the first time in a long time with a choice of who to engage with. But let's fast forward to 2012, 2013, when Xi Jinping comes to power. China then introduces the Belt and Road. And all of a sudden now, from the 10 years of the Belt and Road, it really doesn't need the oil and minerals and timber that comes out of Africa because it can get that in much larger quantities from Brazil, from the Middle East, even from the United States and Southeast Asia, Australia. And so Africa doesn't export in the volumes that those places do. So when we look at China-Africa trade, again, around $282 billion, in regional terms, it's at the very bottom of China's regional trade relationships. Now, out of a $6 trillion global trade portfolio, Africa is insignificant to China, between 3 and 4%. So if it's not economics and it's not trade and it's not what comes out of the ground, why is Africa important to China? Well, it's politics. Africa votes as a bloc at multilateral fora more than any other region in the world. And so when China is trying to push back on the West, when China is trying to push adoption of Huawei and norms and standards, Africa plays a very important role. When China wants to introduce new governance architectures like the Global Civilization Initiative, the Security Initiative, the Development Initiative, the BRICS, the New Development Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, Africa's participation in those becomes incredibly important. And so I would say that Africa's role for China now is in politics and not in economics. And that is a radical departure from Africa's engagement with other regions and countries around the world for the past 400 years.
We've just had the most recent BRICS summit back in October. Given all of the diplomatic spats between Taiwan, which is a U.S. ally, and their relationship with China, do you feel that these kinds of conflicts can push South Africa closer to China through BRICS?
South Africa will tell you no. South Africa will tell you that it can maintain relationships with Russia, with China, with the United States, that it has an autonomous foreign policy, and that just because they're more closely aligned in some ways with U.S. rivals does not necessarily mean that they're diminishing the relationship with the United States. That the South African government will tell you is very important and irresponsible to say otherwise. The U.S.-South Africa relationship is critically important. U.S. auto manufacturing is a major part of their industrial base. U.S. investment is very strong in South Africa, very dynamic and robust people-to-people exchanges. This is a very dynamic relationship. And so I think in some ways it's a little bit reductive to suggest that, and this is a common narrative that's out there today, that because South Africa is engaging all of these different actors in the world community, that in some ways it's turning its back on the U.S. The South African government and DIRCO in particular, the foreign ministry, has been very articulate in pushing back against that narrative. And I think this is something that is also used against other developing countries when they get close to China or get close to Russia. And again, here, in Vietnam, in India, in Brazil, they are balancing these relationships just the same way that South Africa is. And it's not a zero-sum game where if they like one, they don't like the other and vice versa.
Okay, well, Eric Olander, thank you so much for joining us today and helping us understand this incredibly complex topic.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
This has been Zoom In, Zoom Out. For more stories from TaiwanPlus News, check us out on social media. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.